Jesus took the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus needed time to pray alone. He told them, "Stay here while I go and pray over there." When he took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, he began to feel sad and anxious. Then he said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Stay here and keep alert with me." Then he went a short distance farther and fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want." Jesus is pleading with God, asking if there was another way to do this, to free humanity from sin, to redeem them from their actions. Jesus knew this wasn't going to be easy and far from pleasant. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus was so stressed at this time. He sweated blood, meaning the capillaries in his skin ruptured under the stress. His body was giving out on him. A second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if it's not possible that this cup be taken away unless I drink it, then let it be what you want." This cup, remember, from the Last Supper, symbolizes his blood, his suffering. "God, is there any other way we can save these humans?" Jesus pleads. He wasn't a wimp. He knew that the weight of the sins of every human being in history was about to be placed on him. Can you imagine the stress he was about to undertake? Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Will you sleep and rest all night? Look, the time has come for the human one to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Look, here comes my betrayer." Judas was a man who spent 3 years seeing Jesus heal the sick, feed the hungry, preach to sinners, raise people from the dead. And after all of that, he turns Jesus over to his enemies, the religious elite who had sought to kill him. Maybe Judas thought he was helping Jesus out, making him famous. Or maybe Judas was just in it for the money. I don't know. Peter steps in and tries to fight off the temple guards, yet chops off a servant's ear instead. And that's when Jesus gets involved. Or do you think that I'm not able to ask my Father and he will send to me more than 12 battle groups of angels right away? But if I did that, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say this must happen? Jesus stops Peter and allows himself to be taken into custody. That's what has to happen. He goes with the guards, but not before placing the servant's ear back on his head. Then all the disciples left Jesus and ran away. Jesus is interrogated and tried in the dead of the night so no one else would know. This wasn't exactly legal for the Jews to do, so everything was hush-hush. Then the high priest stood and said to Jesus, "Aren't you going to respond to the testimony these people have brought against you?" But Jesus was silent. The high priest said, "By the living God, I demand that you tell us whether you are the Christ, God's Son." "You said it," Jesus replied. "But I say to you that from now on you'll see the human one sitting at the right side of the Almighty and coming on the heavenly clouds." They asked Jesus, "In the name of God, are you God's Son?" And Jesus broke his silence. "You said it," he replied. They are invoking God's name, his truth, in the same breath as they were insulting, reviling, and beating God himself. Their religious fervor blinded them to the God who was in front of them. And they answered, "He deserves to die." Then they spit in his face and beat him. The Jews couldn't execute someone. Only the Romans had that power. So Jesus was brought to Pilate, the Roman governor of Palestine. Now, Pilate was a sympathetic politician who had no desire to kill Jesus. Statesmen lead people. Politicians, on the other hand, are subject to the whim of the people. And that's exactly what happened to Pilate. Pilate offered to release one prisoner to the crowds. He gave the gathered crowds a choice. They could release Barabbas, who some called a freedom fighter, but others called a terrorist, or Jesus. Now, the same crowds who welcomed Jesus, singing his praises just days before, they got to make the decision. The governor said, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" "Barabbas," they replied. Pilate said, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who's called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." But he said, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." The governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's house, and they gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand, and they bowed down in front of him and mocked him, saying, "Hey, King of the Jews." After they spit on him, they took the stick and they struck his head again and again. Roman soldiers don't have mercy. They weren't trained to be compassionate. They had lost many friends to Jewish insurgents, so they hated the Jews. They hated Jesus because he was a Jew that others wanted dead. So they beat him, mocked him, and spit on him. If they would have had cameras back then, they would have taken pictures with him, all bloody and bruised, half conscious. Many people didn't survive a Roman beating. Many people would just give up their will to live, but not Jesus. Stripped naked and nailed to a rough-hewn beam. That's what happened to Jesus. Crucifixion was a long death. It was meant to be painful, but only slowly lethal. Its purpose was humiliation. Everyone could see you strung up, slowly dying for your actions. After they crucified him, they divided up his clothes among them by drawing lots. They sat there guarding him. They placed above his head the charge against him. It read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." "Save yourself," they said. "If you're God's son, then come down from the cross." What they didn't know was that because he was God's son, he must stay on that cross. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At about 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Sin separates us from God. Jesus became the sacrifice for our sin. That means your sin and my sin was placed on him. Jesus experienced that same separation from God the way you and I do. He never ceased to be Jesus, but as he took on our sin, he took on what sin does to us. It separates. Again, Jesus cried out with a loud shout. Then he died. Look, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook. The rocks split. In that moment, the curtain in the temple, this thick, heavy piece of fabric that separated humans from the area of the temple that represented God's throne, it ripped in two. No longer would there be a separation between God and humans because sin had just been paid for. It was finished. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and what had just happened, they were filled with awe and said, "This was certainly God's Son."